So our first panel start the discussion on modern architecture with individual case studies of national modernisms. And here I will leave the floor to the moderator of the session, Professor Giedrė Jankevičiūtė. She is an art historian and the leading research fellow in art history and visual cultural department at the Lithuanian Institute for Cultural Research, and a professor of art history in Vilnius Academy of Arts. And her numerous books on interwar cultural scene is a benchmark for research of that period. She's also involved in different exhibitions and projects on interwar art and architecture. So, Giedrė, now is the time to introduce your session and your speakers. Welcome.
Thank you, Vaidas. Hello to everybody. And I am really honored to start the first working session of our conference, our quite long-lasting conference, 2 days, on interwar modernism architecture. It's logic that we begin from the national modernisms, and thank you very much, Mart, for preparing the basis to discuss the national modernism and the expressions of nationalism in architecture. The Europe after the First World War was really obsessed by the issues of identity, and the necessity to express the national identity became particularly important as the new, young, ambitious states emerged or reappeared, but also the old states had to position themselves on the political and cultural map of Europe, which changed a lot. The sign of those attempts we can find even if we just look at the terms of architectural styles which were used at the time. Yesterday in the forum which preceded today's conference, Professor Šlapeta, for instance, was talking about Czech rondo cubismus. Professor Mart Kalm introduced us to the outstanding example of the Estonian expressionism, which is the parliament house inserted in Jungtinė Castle at the early 20s. That's why the nationalist discourse help us to identify the particularities of modernist architecture in different regions and states, and provides a lens through which to analyze the neo-traditionalist deviations and to question their symbolic and architectural meaning. The speakers of the session, of this panel, will discuss the influence which nationalism had on interwar modernism in Czechoslovakia, Latvia, and Italy. So we have the section along the Europe from north to the south, and it gives us quite a wide perspective, and I hope will arouse many questions from the audience. I would like to present you the first speaker, our keynote speaker of the panel, Professor Matthew Rampley. He is the chair of art history in the Department of Art History, Curating and Visual Studies at the University of Birmingham. His main teaching and research interests are in contemporary art, art criticism and theory, and of course as well as architecture and art of Central Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. That's why he's here with us. Professor Rampley is currently working on two particular projects. The first one, Museums and Cultural Politics in the later Habsburg Empire, and the second one, the relationship between art theory and the biological sciences. And his recent publication is devoted to the last of the projects. The book called The Seductions of Darwin, Art, Evolution and Neuroscience, and it was published in 2017. He has numerous publications, and I would like to mention two of them. Two volumes edited by Matthew Rampley. The first one is called Heritage, Ideology and Identity in Central and Eastern Europe. It was published in 2012. And Art, History and Visual Studies in Europe, Transnational Discourses and National Frameworks. And the title of his presentation, which we will hear here, it's Architecture of Faith, Modernism, Religion and State Identity Between the Wars. Matthew, the floor is yours, please.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm afraid that's the last Lithuanian you're going to hear from me. It's a great pleasure to come here, and what I'm going to talk about today is in fact the beginnings of a project that I've just starting, funded by the European Research Council. So I have to say I had a certain smile to myself when Brexit was mentioned earlier. I was wondering how long it would take before somebody would mention Brexit, but anyway. And it's to do with, the project is to do with the aftermath of 1918 and the question of continuities and rupture in, after the collapse of Austria-Hungary, in particular, to what extent did the creation of new states lead to a caesura in artistic and cultural life? What were the patterns of continuity and discontinuity? And I'm going to be talking about ambiguity, ambivalence, and also about our own prejudices when we look back on the past and the extent to which we have certain exclusions in the narratives of 20th century modernism. Now this may seem, the question of continuity and rupture within Central Europe may seem a deceptively simple question, but the answers are less so. Readers of Stefan Zweig, Miklos Barnfi or Robert Musil might think that the topic has been done to death. The American scholar Marjorie Perloff, for example, has written a very persuasive account of what she terms Austro-Modernism, by which she refers to the way that the literature between the wars in Central Europe constantly operated in the shadow of the Habsburg Empire. But surprisingly, within art history, the issue has only now started to be explored in any depth. The Belvedere Gallery in Vienna, for example, just closed its summer exhibition with the title Klimt ist nicht das Ende, or interestingly just translated into English as Beyond Klimt, in order to remind audiences that art in Austria continued after the death of Klimt in 1918, although it was a rather peculiar exhibition because you went into the first room and it was just full of paintings by Klimt, so it seemed to be undercutting itself. Anyway, but it's as if the traditional account of art and architecture in Vienna is as if after the deaths of Klimt, Egon Schiele, Otto Wagner and Koloman Moser, all in 1918, everything stopped. The only exiles, such as Oskar Kokoschka, attracted much attention, or the social housing of Red Vienna, primarily because, of course, the latter was in keeping with the tenets of the wider international avant-garde. For a long time, this same kind of blindness or reluctance to talk about the interwar period was true of Hungary too. Although there wasn't the same coincidence of the deaths of leading pre-war artists that there was in Vienna, nevertheless, the visual arts in interwar Hungary were passed over in silence, certainly by international commentators. The only figures who really attracted much interest were figures such as Lajos Kossuth or László Moholy Nagy, who spent their most productive years abroad and thus hardly counted as Hungarian at all. I think the reason for this silence are clear. It reflects the wider ambivalence with which political and social life between the wars was later viewed internationally and also by Austrians and Hungarians. Retrospect is also responsible for the fact that the art of the new Czechoslovak Republic enjoyed an entirely different critical reception. Because whereas the new Austrian and Hungarian states were marked by the trauma of defeat, dismemberment and moral failure, Czechoslovakia could thrive on myths, and I am very interested in the function of myths within the historiography of the 20th century, on myths of rebirth and liberation. And critical judgments of the visual arts benefited from this no less than in Hungary and Austria, where it was affected negatively. The fact that Czechoslovakia flourished in the 1920s and 30s as a centre of avant-garde art, architecture and design only added to the image of the new state as a beacon of progressive art and culture, one which has been assiduously cultivated ever since. Yet as a perceptive exhibition called The Building of the State, Budování státu, staged in Prague in 2015, argued, this image plunges us into the world of myth-making. The idea that 1918 was a year zero in the visual arts is a construction that serves rather more to promote ideologically informed notions of national history than to offer a nuanced account of the unfolding story of the visual arts. Now, it's with this set of considerations that I want to talk about and start off with a much commented episode, the pulling down of the 17th century Marian column in the Old Town Square in Prague on the 3rd of November 1918. Its demolition was the work of a mob led by the writer Franz Sauer or Franta Kieseler, depending on how you might, means the same thing, but how you might want to think of him. But the destruction chimed with the wishes of the new administration that would take power in removing a symbol of Habsburg rule. In fact, having been erected in 1652, it was in fact a thanksgiving for deliverance from the Swedish siege of Prague of 1648. But for many Czech nationalists in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, it was a symbol not only of temporal Habsburg power, of course, but also of the dominance of Catholicism. Later, Mojec Hruban, who was the leader of the Moravian National Catholic Party in Czechoslovakia, would complain that the celebration of national independence was accompanied by a strong current of anti-Catholicism and anti-clericalism. And this was given visible form too in the Jan Hus Memorial, situated only meters away from the Marian column, which was unveiled in 1915 on the 500th anniversary of the burning of Hus in Constance. Now, art historians have often tended to view the demolition of the Marian column in secular terms. The demolition has tended to be seen as the act of an increasingly secular national movement, corroborated by the embrace and promotion of the avant-garde by the Czechoslovak state. Indeed, the Hus Memorial has itself tended to often be seen not as an example of religious symbolism, but rather as an instance of the impact of French modernism, in particular Auguste Rodin on Czech sculpture in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. For its maker, Ladislav Šalom, was one of the leading members of a generation of sculptors who were immensely influenced by a much discussed exhibition of Rodin staged in Prague in 1902. And the Prague cityscape is still dotted with these sculptural homage to the French artist. Even the meaning of the Hus monument has tended to be viewed in a secular manner, as an example of the way in which Hus became first and foremost a lieu de mémoire of Czech national identity, rather than being associated with a set of theological beliefs. This conflation of theology and politics is only strengthened, I think, if we look at there's a legend around the podium of the monument, which simply says, I believe that the government of your things will return to you, a Czech people. Now, I think there's a reason why art historians tend to emphasize the secular aspects of the memorial. Indeed, wished to go along happily with the myth of the progressive secular Czechoslovakia, and that's to do with the profound discomfort with the religiosity in art in the 20th century. Most art historians who write about modern art tend to be avowedly non-religious and left-wing in their politics. Hence, the embrace of religious beliefs, especially those associated with organized, state-sanctioned churches, is seen as regressive. As a consequence, historical accounts can be skewed. The silence I referred to with regard to interwar Austria, for example, is due in part to the fact that many of the artists active there in the 1920s and 30s, such as Herbert Berkel, were avowedly Catholic. As a result, most Austrian art and architecture of this period has fallen into oblivion, with the exception of projects such as the Karl Marx Hof. Yet in fact, interwar Czechoslovakia was not so different from Austria. For Kieseler, Sauer, was no secular nationalist, but rather a devout Catholic, for whom the column was primarily a political symbol. Indeed, he sought to defend Catholicism as a state religion. He was not alone. At the laying of the foundation stone of the Hus monument in 1903, the former mayor of Prague, Jan Podlipny, had declared that Hus had actually never left the Catholic faith, but had merely protested against the abuse of power by the hierarchy within the church. This distinction permitted Hus to be appropriated on behalf of Catholicism, and indeed, with political Catholicism maintaining a presence as a political force in the 1920s, several times it was proposed that the column should be re-erected. Now, since publication of Bruce Berglund's study Castle and Cathedral in Modern Prague, a more general case can be made for a nuanced understanding of cultural politics in Czechoslovakia. For it was no less a person than Tomáš Masaryk who longed for an age of re-enchantment of modernity, not admittedly by boosting the fortunes of the Catholic Church, but rather through a kind of humanistic religiosity. Masaryk would later say, and I quote, "I saw in politics an instrument. The aim for me was religious and moral. Still today, I do not say that the state will be the fulfillment of a cultural mission. Instead, we must work towards building the city of God." Hus figured prominently in this vision, and this lay behind Masaryk's support for the creation of the Czechoslovak Hussite Church in 1920. Now, for Berglund, the most visible expression of this attempt to overcome secularization was Masaryk's decision to commission Jerzy Plečnik to rebuild Prague Castle as an emblem of this newly sacralized state. The choice of Plečnik was a significant one because, unlike his contemporaries, and Plečnik was a student of Otto Wagner, he remained a devout Catholic. Moreover, perhaps his most striking work outside of Ljubljana is the famous Church of the Most Sacred Heart of Our Lord in the suburb of Vinohrady in Prague. Historians, including Berglund, tend to refer to this as an example of modern architecture. Well, that's because historians often get architecture wrong. But anyway, but in fact it's anything but an example of orthodox modernism, of course. Because by the late 1920s, functionalism had become the prevailing language of architecture in Prague. Because the year work started on Plečnik's church, 1929, the Batiustor by Ludwig Kieseler, my apologies, my mistake, it shouldn't be František, that was another figure, opened on one side of Wenceslas Square, and on the other, the Hotel Juliš by Pavel Janák, which opened the year after. Both of them used a completely different idiom. And with this use of neoclassical references and its immersion in the theories of the 19th century architect Gottfried Semper, Plečnik's Church of the Most Sacred Heart of Our Lord is a vivid reminder that the image of Czechoslovakia as the state of the progressive avant-garde is to some degree a simplification. Other examples might be brought alongside to support Berglund's interpretation. The convergence of faith and nationalism was in evidence in the project of completing St. Vitus's Cathedral in 1929, which wasn't the work merely of pious and backward-looking conservatives, but involved some of the major figures in the Czech art world. They included, for example, yes, there we are, František Kýsela and Alfons Mucha. While Mucha was executing the windows here, the stained glass window, he was also completing his monumental cycle of 20 paintings, the Slav Epic. Now, although popular with tourists and in constant demand by foreign audiences, for some reason the Slav Epic is very popular in Japan, apparently. I have no idea why, but anyway, that's another issue. The Slav Epic was often somewhat of an embarrassment for many Czechs because its bombastic, overblown historical representations seemed to belong to another age and to be completely anachronistic in the 1920s. But its inscription of Czech history in a deeper metaphysical drama of Slav myth and legend was, I would argue, in certain respects, not so far removed from Masaryk's version of redemption through the embrace of a renewed religiosity. Now, so far it might be assumed that I've done little other than to embellish Berglund's account with a few more examples and details. The fact that Plečnik's church, as well as Mucha's Slav Epic, seemed out of step with so many other currents in artistic life of the time might tempt us to concluding simply that alongside the avant-garde, there were other figures who stood at some remove from the leftist politics of much modernist practice and who held to considerably more conservative social, cultural and political views. In this sense, Czechoslovakia was unremarkable, uncomparable to most other states, and we might hardly expect anything else. The fact that this other modernism, provincial, nationalistic, religious, has been neglected, and of course there are parallels with every other European state, and simply dismissed as reactionary, says more perhaps, though, about the prejudices of art historians than about its merits. But in any case, I'm not interested in trying to rehabilitate some awkward works of art and architecture. Indeed, the story in Czechoslovakia is more interesting than that. Specifically, I wish to point out the paradox that some of the most notable examples of modernist architecture in the interwar period were churches. This distinguishes Czechoslovakia from Austria, for example, where the energies of the avant-garde went into housing projects, and where, despite the growing importance of Catholicism to the attempts to refashion Austrian state and national identity, there was remarkably little ecclesiastical building between the wars. This considerably complicates the picture of interwar Czechoslovakia, since the opposition between a secular avant-garde and a conservative religious anti-modernism no longer holds, even though many still tend to write about it in these terms. For there are many reasons why one might be tempted to do so. Take one example. A prominent feature of modernist architecture in Czechoslovakia is the disproportionate number of crematoria. I say disproportionate simply because it's notable in comparison with, for example, Germany or France. They include important instances such as the crematorium in Brno by Arnošt Wiesner, or the slightly earlier purist construction by Bedřich Feuerstein and Bohumil Slama in Nymburk. And most perplexing of all is the crematorium in Pardubice by Pavel Janak, a singularly distinctive example of the short-lived national style. I could mention many others, and it could be possible to narrate the history of Czech architecture simply by using crematoria as examples, since they were treated as opportunities by many architects for engaging with virtually all of the experiments in architectural design that occurred between 1918 and 1939. I'm conscious that I've not mentioned Slovakia here, for the crematoria in the major towns and cities there appear to date from the communist period, and there are good reasons why. Because the common thread is that whereas cremation had been illegal under Habsburg rule, it was permitted in the new Czechoslovakia, and this alone was the signal of a desire by the authorities to remove regulations that were due to Catholic strictures. If modernist experimentation could be associated with the type of building that signified the overcoming of Austrian Catholicism, it was also in evidence in the case of the Czechoslovak Hussite Church. This newly created church required new buildings, and this led to a range of new structures often designed by some of the leading representatives of the Czech avant-garde. This was the case not only in Prague, but also in other provincial towns. In Hradec Králové, for example, the Hussite Church of Ambrose, formally opened in 1929, was designed by Josef Gottschalk, better known as one of the three main exponents of Cubist architecture before the First World War. The pure geometries of its design was a symbol of the extent to which Gottschalk had adopted the language of functionalism, but served too as a visual symbol of doctrinal purity. And this undoubtedly explains the ease too with which the new church reached an accommodation with contemporary architectural design, and also perhaps why a figure such as Gottschalk, who unlike Plečnik had no obvious religious leanings, was commissioned to design the building. Bohemia and Moravia abound with examples of Hussite modernism, such as in Brno, where a Hussite church was built in the suburb of Veverší in 1929, following design by Jan Vyšek and Bohuslav Fuchs. The involvement of Fuchs is notable here, for like Gottschalk, he was not simply a local architect with an interest in functionalism, but rather one of the key representatives of the architectural avant-garde that ensured that Brno occupied a prominent place on the map of international modernism. A late example, the Karel Farský Church, named after the first patriarch of the Czechoslovak Hussite Church, erected in the small town of Semilí near Liberec in northern Bohemia in 1938, might serve as a final illustration of this phenomenon. With its curved lines, it shows the interest in the aesthetic of streamlining that became prevalent globally in design and architecture of the 1930s. But as the photograph indicates, it also demonstrates that the intertwining of faith and international modernism was not limited to the metropolis, but was also disseminated across small towns and villages and the landscape. Now, so far, it might appear that we need to modify traditional accounts of interwar modernism in Czechoslovakia by looking not only at its ideological functions and role in the program of state building and identity formation, a process that's now gained widespread acceptance, but also by examining the way that intersected with questions of faith and confessional allegiance. Masaryk's idea of Czechoslovakia as a religious as well as a socio-cultural mission was given architectural form by the Hussite churches, which perhaps underpinned the vision of a renewed piety, but one that was modern rather than associated with the reactionary tenets fostered by the Catholic Church. But things get a bit more complicated. In 1928, Brno hosted the International Exhibition of Contemporary Culture to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Czechoslovak independence. As with all such events, it was a showcase for the host city, with sections on design, radio and cinema, science, intellectual and technical culture. It was meant to make visible the idea of a technologically and aesthetically advanced republic. With a special pavilion representing the German Werkbund, the exhibition also cemented the place of Brno as a centre of contemporary architecture and design, a counterweight perhaps to Prague, which was still so burdened by the weight of historical associations. Just away from the main exhibition site in the suburb of Žabovčesky was a small estate of 16 functionalist houses built and designed by, amongst others, Bohuslav Fuchs, Arnošt Wiesner, and Jan Vyšek, so it's these same figures keep recurring. Inspired by the Weissenhof Siedlung by the Werkbund that was built the year before, The so-called new house colony, Colony Novidum, was meant to flag up the commitment not only to technological modernity, but also to a democratic social vision in keeping with the wider political self-styling of the state. Now, this placing of the colony was not accidental, because it was in part determined by the availability of land, but it was also just around the corner. In fact, according to Google Maps, it's about 6 minutes by walking from this, the Jurkovic villa. The villa of Dusan Jurkovic, the Slovak pioneer of folklore revivalism from around the turn of the century. So there's a deliberate intent to kind of act as a counterweight and a contrast to that different kind of modernism from 20 years before. There's also another opposition that needs to be noted, however, and one that's more pertinent for us, because only 10 minutes further on from the Jurkovic house is the Church of St. Augustine. I've just marked it there, as you can see on the map. I'm going to try and make a fool of myself trying to operate this thing. It doesn't matter anyway, you can see it. The Church of St. Augustine on the Square of Peace, built between 1930 and 1935. Designed by Vladimir Fischer, it typifies the interwar ecclesiastical embrace of high modernism. Fischer had spent the late 1890s working in the studio of the highly successful Viennese firm of Fellner and Helmer. And while he'd almost certainly left Vienna by this time, there's more than a hint of Adolf Loos to this design too, especially in the degree to which he exploited on the interior, and unfortunately it doesn't come out particularly well in this photograph, the decorative properties of the material itself, which is reminiscent of the Loos house in Vienna, for example, in favour of additional architectural ornament. But as the name of the church might suggest, this was no Hussite church, but rather a Catholic church. The foundation stone was laid on the 28th of August in commemoration of the 1500th anniversary of the death of St. Augustine. The proximity of these three buildings in the suburbs of Brno provides a symbol of the contradictions and ambiguities of the Czechoslovak negotiation of modernity from the early 1900s to the late 1930s. Folklorism, nationalism, cosmopolitanism, technological functionalism, democratic socialism, and submission to the authority of the church all coexisted and found expression in architectural form. The Church of St. Augustine further complicates the picture of the architecture of faith in Czechoslovakia, since we can no longer simply speak of Hussite and other Protestant churches appropriating modernism as a means of signalling distance from Catholic tradition, since some of the most important examples of modernist ecclesiastical structures were commissioned by the Catholic Church. Fischer had already designed another church in Brno, Catholic church that is, the foundation of St. John of Nepomuk in the suburb of Stary Liskovec, but with its rusticated base and pitched roof, it's a much more traditional kind of design. But much more striking is the Church of St. Wenceslas in Prague by Gottschalk again, built in 1929 as part of the millennial celebration of Wenceslas. The design breaks with conventions in numerous ways. From the front, the main body of the church is hardly visible, hidden by the oversized porch and the soaring tower, and yet the apparent triumph of technology, evident in both the machine aesthetic of its geometrical forms, as well as the apparent conquest of technology, conquest of gravity, conveys a profoundly metaphysical and spiritual concern, because everything about the church connotes ascension, implying not only the resurrection of the spirit of St. Wenceslas, but also the ascent of the individual believer to communion with God. And the design challenge of building a church on a steep plot of land is converted into a religious symbol. So you have here the sense in which the building itself, on these multi-layers, it connotes a spiritual ascension. St. Wenceslas was, of course, a national symbol for secular as well as for pious Czechs. But Gottschalk's design is remarkable for its sensitivity to the dimensions of religious life and for its attempt to turn the language of functionalism into an allegory of spiritualism. Gottschalk's church is perhaps the best known example of Catholic functionalist architecture, but there are others. Further out from the centre of Prague is the 1935 Church of St. Anne, and in the southwestern Prague suburb of Košice is the Church of St. John of Nepomuk, completed in 1942 by Jaroslav Čermák, architect of a number of Catholic churches in the same idiom in Prague and further afield. I could list many other examples, but they're not needed to make the point. Now, this brief overview will hopefully have thrown up a few thoughts I'm still trying to develop myself, but I might try to summarize where I've got to so far. A certain image of the art and culture of Czechoslovakia has become rooted in the historical imagination amongst many scholars, according to which it was the locus of a progressive secular and democratic politics and culture. This view is encapsulated perhaps in the recent title alone of an important book from 2013 by Derek Sayre called Prague, Capital of the 20th Century. Ultimately, however, Derek Sayre and others are colluding in a carefully crafted myth. Quite apart from the fact that Germans, Jews, Slovaks, Hungarians and Ruthenians hardly ever figure in this narrative, it represents a partial view of even Czech life in Bohemia and Moravia, for it contributes to a minimizing of the role of Catholicism as a social, cultural and political force in the new republic. It underplays, for example, the extent to which even the status of Jan Hus as emblem of Czech identity was disputed. Collective memory was thus not as settled as we might imagine it to have been. But as an art historian, my attention is focused less on the question of Czechoslovak identity per se, and more on architecture. Given that political Catholicism became increasingly assertive during the 1920s, it's perhaps no surprise it may have found some channel for expression in art and architecture, and, coupled with Masaryk's own theologico-political ideas, ensured that artistic life in Czechoslovakia was not as secular as it's traditionally held to have been. What the examples I've chosen also point to is the ease with which the language of functionalism in architecture lent itself to completely different projects. It's striking too how extensively the architects with the broader leftist and secular political orientation collaborated with and worked for churches of all denominations. We may explain this as responding to the exigencies of professional life. A commission is a commission after all, but nevertheless this interferes with our image of the architectural profession of this period, one in which Plečnik was seen as an outlier. It problematizes too, I think, the way in which the categories of the secular and the religious are employed, and whether, when they're mapped onto the landscape of modernity, they can be so easily distinguished. Finally, it may also make us rethink the role of Catholicism. For while Catholic politicians, intellectuals and press promulgated what is often regarded as a deeply conservative and anti-modern social and cultural vision, the evidence of the architecture suggests otherwise. For the Church proved as adept at mobilizing the avant-garde as the administration of the new republic, or indeed any other groups with a seemingly more progressive agenda. Thank you very much.